Thank you, everyone. As you know, I'm Brian Hurley, and I'm sitting as chairman of the three-member Board of Appeals for the town of Milton in connection with the 40B application of 648 to 652 Canton Avenue in Milton. We've had a number of public hearing sessions over a lengthy period of time. And at present, we contemplate that we would do tonight and next week and then close the public hearing, although we'll see how that goes. We've received a fair amount of information very recently, including a memo from Sean Reardon of Tetra Tech that was dated March 3rd, 2022. And we also received additional information, I believe, from Scott Horsley and perhaps others today by email. And I've not had a chance to print and read the material that came this afternoon. So we may have to take that up. I'm certainly happy to hear about it tonight, but I may have to take it up again next week after I've had a chance to read it. The one issue that seems to really come to the fore in our consideration and analysis of this application has been and continues to be the subject of groundwater. And it's, I have to be honest and say, at least for myself, it's a slightly perplexing topic, but it's a very important topic. And speaking only for myself, I need to be absolutely certain in my own mind that we're not going to be passing on a project that's going to create significant groundwater issues for people in the neighborhood. And I know that because I read yesterday Sean Reardon's report, the March 3rd, 2022 report, and he pretty definitively suggests that there will be no increase in groundwater issues for the neighborhood as a consequence of this plan and program. And I want to hear more from him tonight about that topic. So water is on my mind tonight in particular, and certainly happy to hear any other issues that people want to bring to bear. I hope to give Scott Horsley an opportunity to speak as well tonight, although I have to, as I said, I have not read what was submitted, and I would hope that he would be available to come back again next week so that we could ask him some questions about those submittals. I don't mean to blame anybody. That's just the way that things work out with respect to some of these filings, and I perfectly well understand that. So those are my 2 cents for the beginning of the evening. Anyone else have any thoughts?
If I do, Mr. Chair, we just did get copies of all of the materials that were filed last week. I know that the board had encouraged the applicant to get those materials to me so that I could get them to my consultants. I never did receive them from the applicant. I became aware that they had been posted to the town's website last Wednesday. I got access to them Thursday. I submitted them to my team. They've had a brief opportunity to review it. I submitted some comments today. Mike Mobile, who is a wetland scientist on our team, is unfortunately in Weston tonight on a similar project. Scott Horsley is here. He's got some preliminary comments, and we would absolutely look forward to a more robust opportunity to present our concerns with respect to this groundwater modeling next Tuesday.
Okay. Anyone else have any introductory comments or remarks? Okay, I would like
from us, if I may, Mr. Chair.
Sure, please do.
Just to make the members aware, since the last time we were together, the applicant has filed with the Milton Conservation Commission, and that review is scheduled to commence next Wednesday evening. And just to remind everyone that the review of stormwater management, including the issue of groundwater mounting, is within the purview of the Conservation Commission. So we welcome a robust discussion of it tonight, but just want to remind everyone that it will be in the front of the minds of the Conservation Commissioners when they review this project.
Can I?
Okay, I appreciate that, but they would look at it, wouldn't they, from a different perspective than we would as zoning board of appeals in a comprehensive permit setting, wouldn't they?
Well, they would be looking at it, Mr. Chair, from the perspective of compliance with the state stormwater regulations, which is what this project is subject to and what we're assessing. in the context of this hearing. It's true that the town does have a stormwater management bylaw. However, we have not requested a waiver from that because it is not necessary since the project is subject to Conservation Commission review.
My
Okay.
question is, to the chair, are you filing with the Conservation Commission on this project? No,
You're asking me that question?
Well, my understanding is they can't do it until they have a comprehensive
okay.
permit.
I guess that is the question. That was my understanding of what was just said.
Right.
Is that right?
Attorney Corcoran is correct. We have applied. It will be heard by the Conservation Commission next Wednesday, the commencement of that hearing. What he is referring to, I believe, is the regulation in the Wetlands Protection Act for all other permits other than wetlands to be in place. That regulation has been interpreted, my understanding, by DEP to require that the applicant has filed and is pursuing other local permits. So our intent is to proceed concurrently with this process, and that one will proceed past the conclusion of this one next Wednesday. Just one further reminder, Mr. Chair, if I could ask Bev Sutton to make Robert Rosine a panelist. He's our groundwater mounting consultant, and he did prepare an updated review, which was in response to some issues that were raised by Mr. Reardon and provided some additional analysis at his request.
Is there a written report to that effect?
There is, Mr. Chair. It was filed last Tuesday.
In response to the March 3rd memo of Mr. Reardon?
No, it was not in response to Mr. Reardon's memo.
Okay, all right. All right, well, why don't we start with Mr. Reardon tonight, if we could. And Mr. Reardon, you on?
I am.
If you could just walk us through this March 3rd report that was submitted to the town, and
Sure.
which we have copies of, it would be helpful.
Sure. And this is a little bit sort of outside the box, sort of just trying to, you know, in talking with the applicants experts and talking with the neighborhoods experts, you know, I found myself frankly getting a bit overwhelmed, and I know this stuff pretty well. And I started thinking to myself, there's got to be hopefully an easier way to communicate and evaluate some of the risks. And I spent, you know, some time thinking about it and tried to put it to paper. And I think I've come up with something that makes sense and is consistent with the information that has been provided, and is consistent with kind of what I perceive as being the fundamental issues. What I wanted to do was take what I was able to sort of figure out and then put it to paper to hopefully make something that can be really complicated at least a bit simpler. And that was the whole idea behind this memo. It wasn't to come to any conclusions firsthand. It was more just to say, look at the numbers and look at the way things were happening and try to get sense of it in a simple way, and then let the conclusions come out where they come out. And you know, they came out to, I think, reflect what the regulations want to have happen, which is we do all this stormwater work to try and make things the same after development as they are before development. And I think the analysis that we've done alludes to that and sort of proves that out. So real quickly, the basic premise is that water that comes from the precipitation either runs off the ground and goes off into the streams and stormwater collection systems, or it goes into the ground. The problem with development is that when you pave a surface that used to be wooded or used to be grass, a lot more runs off the ground. And the stormwater standards try to sort of mitigate that by giving us different ways to instead of just letting it continue to run off the ground and overwhelm systems downstream, to hold it on site so that it doesn't overwhelm systems downstream, and to more importantly, put some of that water that used to go back into the ground back into the ground. And that's why we have these big underground infiltration systems on this project, because so much of the site is wooded or grass, and so much of the site is being converted to roof and pavement which generally has a lot of runoff. So that's why we have such a big volume of underground storage. And I spent a good amount of time talking with Scott Horsley and the team from the neighborhood, and had some really good points, and it made me think twice about things. And I said, I really need to figure out, okay, how much water is going back into the ground and how much water is running off the ground. So what I did is I used the HydroCAD, the tool that we all use for analyzing stormwater and analyzing basins and underground detention. Yeah, this is a tool that everybody uses, and it's just ubiquitous and understood that this is the way this is the tool to use. We can extract information from that tool that tells us, okay, how much water is going into the ground under pre-development and how much water is going into the ground under the post-development condition. And what we found is that during the small sort of 1-inch storm, and I'm using a 1-inch storm as an example of a big storm that happens every year, we found that almost exactly the same amount of water pre-development conditions as is going into the ground under post-development conditions. So the conclusion that we drew from that was, well, then there's not going to be a rise in groundwater associated with that. Then as we get into sort of higher storm events, we start to look at there's a little bit more flexibility there. We look at a slightly larger storm event and a 2-year event. We see that a little bit more water going into the ground under post-development conditions than pre-development conditions. So what we said is, okay, well, if there's more water going into the ground, then we need to understand how much water it is. And in this case, it's about 0.09 acre feet, which correlates to about 1/10 of an inch of water going into the ground over a 3-day, 4-day period. So in our mind, 1/10 of an inch wasn't enough to considerably alter things off site. And then if you look in even the higher storm events, we actually have less water going into the ground under post-development conditions than under pre-development conditions. So as it relates to just specifically the risk to elevating groundwater, well, if there's less water going into the ground, then the presumption there we thought was reasonably to conclude that we weren't going to end up with a rise in elevation. It is a pretty simplistic approach. I mean, there are a lot of nuances. I'm sure the applicants, experts will talk about those, but in a sort of a mass balance sense, in a gross sense, I'm confident that that there's not going to be any substantive changes at the property line, and that's in large part because most of the infiltration system is right in the middle of the site. So we would expect to have most of the groundwater mound at that point, that by the time you get to the property boundary, it would have been minimized to almost a negligible extent.
I think you described this, Scott, as imperceptible.
In my opinion, yes.
And that is based on this HydroCAD that I guess everyone uses for this purpose.
And the difference being is, you've heard the term mod flow. It's really, really, really powerful tool for analyzing how water moves through soil and moves through underlying mediums like sands and things like that. So it's a very, very powerful tool for determining how groundwater moves. But it's not such a great tool for stormwater, because stormwater is just it's random, and it doesn't occur in any repetitive pattern. So I felt more comfortable that HydroCAD was a better tool for understanding the impacts of what would happen to groundwater, what would happen to the infiltration component that, in a sense, creates the change to groundwater that we're concerned about.
Sean, on page 2 of your March 3rd report, you at the top of the page, you've put in a schematic, I guess, as you describe it. Can you just explain to us what this shows? I think I understand it, but I just want to be sure.
Sure, and just no jokes, because this is my hand sketch. So just
I not a single joke from me.
So the basic premise too is that, remember, projects don't make it rain any more than it rained before. So we're still dealing with the same amount of rainwater coming onto the ground. The question is, what's happened to it once it gets on the ground? So either the rain hits the ground and it either runs off and goes into streams and things like that, or it gets into the ground. And I think what most people don't understand is that most of the water that hits the ground it ends up staying in the ground. So it takes a lot of water. Like if you had a wet pavement, it takes like a quarter of an inch of rainfall or an eighth of an inch of rainfall just to wet the pavement. So, just because it hits the ground doesn't mean it runs off. So what I wanted to communicate here is that it all starts with, we've got about an 8-acre site, and then we have a certain amount of rainfall that hits the ground. Now, that's that precipitation P. And we have HydroCat has curves that represent how that rainfall happens, because it happens at different intensities over a 24-hour period and things like that. So we have tools that predict how that rainfall acts. But it boils down to is you've got 8 acres of rainfall hitting the ground, that the water's going to go somewhere. It either goes into the ground, that's infiltration, or it runs off. Under pre-development conditions, it runs off as a discharge, so it ends up going off the site. So basically, the rainfall is the sum of your infiltration and your discharge. Now, when we have a development, we're changing that dynamic. So a lot more would run off as discharge. And if that was just left the way it was, then what you'd have is you'd have people getting flooded downstream, because a lot more water is going a lot faster downstream under post-development conditions than does under pre-development conditions. So you'd have more water going through the neighbor's yard, or more water going to the stream than you did before. So what we do is we build ponds, or we build underground detention to do two things: to hold the water so that we can let it go a little bit slower, and to give it a chance to go back into the ground where otherwise it wouldn't. So that's where you get that storage S, which is a little rectangle with the semicircular circles in it. That's meant to reflect an underground detention system. And then two things happen once the water that would have run off the pavement before goes into this underground detention system. It sits there and it gives it a chance to percolate back into the ground, and still a portion of it runs off. So that's why you have that discharge DS from storage and infiltration IS from storage. And the idea is that your pre-development infiltration rate, we're trying to compensate for the change that's created by the development by introducing this new infiltration that's coming from the underground detention systems to hopefully approximate what happens under pre-development conditions. And I think, the people that came up with the Massachusetts standards and the methods for analyzing, ended up doing something pretty on the ball, because when you look at it from a total water standpoint, it's pretty close under most of these storms at how much water ends up in the ground versus how much water ends up running off.
Sean, if you wouldn't mind, could you walk us through the infiltration summary at the bottom of the page?
Sure. So there's 3 different design storms we looked at, because I don't know if you remember, but the last hearing we talked a lot about the 100-year storm.
I do.
And keep in mind, again, I mentioned it last time, these are not real events. They're statistical events that we engineers use for the purposes of making sure all our analyses are the same, that we're all talking the same language. They don't really exist in real life. It's just a theoretical event, but it's meant to approximate different storms of different intensities. So in this case, we have 3 storm events that I looked at were a typical max yearly, which is about an inch storm. And that's a term that I use, typical max early. It's like, it's a good heavy storm, but it's something that you can count on happening every year. And I wanted to look at that because so much of what we analyze is the larger storm events, because that's when you have a lot more runoff and that's when damage occurs. We don't spend a whole lot of time looking at these small storm events because, frankly, if we take care of the big ones, we know the small ones will be taken care of. But in talking with Scott Horsley, he was concerned about the fact that, well, under these small events, we're infiltrating a lot more water than we used to. So I looked at that one and found that, okay, under these normal big year storms, we're almost infiltrating almost the exact same amount of water as we were under pre-development conditions. Then I looked at the 2-year storm, which is sort of our lowest storm for analyzing peak runoff, just again to get a sense as to where things were trending and how things varied over the range of 1 year to 100 year, and that's the 2-year storm, and then the 100-year storm is the big storm, and the way we quantify those is if you look at the rainfall. So that's the volume of water. So there's 1 inch of rainfall over the entire site for the 1-year storm, 3.4 inches of rainfall over the entire site. So you can imagine that's a lot of rainfall. That means that for every square foot, you've got an inch of rainfall falling on that each square foot of the site. So that's a lot of water. And then on the 100-year, it's 8.36. And yeah, I always feel awkward about saying 8.36, but that's actually the number that's calculated by engineers that says this is the exact number for this region, that the 100-year recurrence interval says it's 8.36 inches of rainfall. And if you can sort of, we get about 42 inches of rain a year, 42 inches of precipitation a year. So that, just to put things in perspective, 100-year rainfall is a lot of water. And as you can imagine, in those situations, a lot more of that runs off the site as opposed to infiltrating into the ground. So you see, as you get into the bigger events, more and more water is running off the site, so less and less is getting infiltrated. And then the rest of the table just goes to show, okay, for each of those events, how much is infiltrating under pre-development and how much is infiltrating under post-development. And you'll see for the 1-inch storm is 0.65 acre feet. That's a foot of water over an acre. It's another volume. It's like cubic feet, but it's just a different way of saying it. Is 0.65 under both pre-development and post-development conditions. So that's a zero change. And that to me, this is the sort of the most important thing is, okay, there is no change during that storm between how much infiltration gets into the ground pre and post-development. Then 2-year, we get a modest change. Again, it's 0.09, which is less than 5% or 4% of the total. It's a pretty modest number. And then we see as we get into the larger storm events, we get slightly less infiltrating than would happen under normal conditions or under pre-development conditions. But in each case, they're pretty small deltas, which was frankly surprising to me. I was surprised that the systems did as good a job as they did.
Mike or Ted, do you have any questions about this report or the information?
No, Mr. Chair.
Ted, any questions?
I may have a couple, and I apologize if I read this. I didn't have time to reread your memo today. I read it before. But this takes into account all the fill that would be brought onto the property for the construction, and the slope, and how that causes it to slope down to the neighboring properties as well.
Well, in a sort of an indirect way. So the only way we create the storage, so in my figure where you have that rectangle with the semicircles in it, the only way you create that volume that's so critical, you need that volume to hold the water so it gives a chance to go into the ground. That rise and fill on the site is what creates that volume. If we didn't raise the site, we wouldn't have any way for the water to be held in place so it can infiltrate back into the ground. So we would start skewing our numbers to the side of a lot more runoff. The answer is yes, but
as to both questions,
yes,
the changing, okay. And does it take into account the kind of soil that would be used for the additional fill?
Yes, because the infiltration number, the number that goes back into the ground through the storage system is predicated on the type of soil that's beneath it.
Okay. I don't think I had any more questions at present. Thank you.
Very quickly, I have one very basic and probably a question that shows my ignorance here, but does this study differentiate between different parts of the project site or different abutting properties? For example, are the impacts of this study different depending on whether you're down at a lower elevation or at a higher elevation or an equal elevation? Does that make sense?
I'd say no, it doesn't, because the principle I apply is that we want to make sure that there's no impact beyond the property line, or we want to understand what the potential magnitude of that impact was. So, for example, the reason why I sort of think about the 0.09 acre feet of change is it's okay. How much new water is there, and what does that correlate to when you apply it to the site? So in this case, I started with, okay, I've got 0.09 acre feet of new water that wasn't there before. Okay, 0.09 acre feet, what does that mean, right? In and of itself, it doesn't mean much. But when you apply it over the site and you start to realize, well, that means that 0.09 acre feet is 1/10 of an inch of water over the site. It's hard to believe that 1/10 of an inch of water over the site, when it starts to get beyond the site, which it starts to become less than 1/10 and less than 1/10 and less than 1/10, it becomes at a certain point de minimis. So in my mind, if I'm looking at 1/10 of an inch increase on the site, then I'm saying everywhere else, it's got to be less than 1/10 of an inch, which is, in my mind, imperceptible.
Right. So my question is, so that makes sense to me, but the way you're probably understanding it is different than the way I'm understanding it. So when you say 1/10 of an inch spread out over the entire site, like that's theoretical, right? So it's not like there's exactly 1/10 of an inch of additional water spread out over the entire site, right? It's got to be less in some places and more in other places.
Right. And that was my point about the location of the system. So all of that extra water originates at these underground detention systems, which in our situation, they're right in the middle of the site. If they were skewed to one particular property boundary, I'd have a higher sensitivity, because again, I would say, okay, yeah, there'd be more water at that location than if it were in the center of the site. So one of the mitigating factors to me is that, okay, well, the system is massive. So we're not talking about a really acute point loading situation. It's a very sort of broad system in and of itself, very large footprint. And it's centrally located. So that if there were going to be a skewed result, it would be on the site, in the middle of the site. Then anything on the periphery would be less so. So for every bit more that you have in the middle of the site, we have less at the perimeter of the site. So in no cases would I expect there to be more than 1/10 of an inch in any situation at the property.
Okay, thanks. One more, and this may be related, and this may be another dumb question, but so we've heard testimony earlier in this hearing about the fact that, there are some neighboring streams and underwater streams and things like that on a neighboring properties. I wouldn't even say abutting, because I think they're kind of just all over the place in this neighborhood. So that's one. Number two, what you've just told me, I think, is that the systems in place, the storage systems in place, will adjust the timing of water discharge from the site. Is that correct?
Adjust the timing and where it goes. So yeah, it puts more into infiltration than otherwise would without the system.
Okay, so leaving aside the impact on the levels of groundwater and the levels of discharge, does the impact on the timing and direction of the discharge affect those other waterways in the neighboring properties and how they drain and how they discharge and how they flow? My concern is for not just the abutting properties, but also those on like Elm Street and downstream, and those abutting that stream that's only a few hundred yards away. That that's a neighborhood that already experiences a lot of water issues, And I just want to make sure that we're not disrupting the flow of that, that part of town's natural, the water flow. Does
Yeah,
that make sense?
it does. I don't think there's anything that's going to happen on this small site that's going to affect the regional groundwater flow or the regional surface water flow. What we're trying to do is administer acute changes based on gross changes to a site. Now, there's absolutely going to be changes. There's no way we can sort of recreate existing conditions exactly, but there are very robust, very well thought standards for how we as engineers are required to design systems. You've heard them, they're called the Massachusetts Stormwater Standards. And they're really good, really well developed. And they're the tools that we have. So through using these tools, we get as close as we can. There will always be changes. I think those changes are going to be de minimis, but there will always be changes.
Under the Massachusetts Stormwater Standards, is there a way to design a project with absolute certainty that there won't be any impact on surrounding neighborhoods from the project?
There's when you say absolute certainty about impact, impact is a sort of a really broad term. I don't think any engineer can say that. What we can say is that the standards are well thought, well conceived, and the project complies with those standards. Beyond that, my opinion is that there won't be any changes, substantive changes. Again, changes can be a lot of different things, right? If you can measure a change, it's a change. And just by virtue of the data that I've shown to date, there for the 2-year storm, there is a change. It's about 1/10 of an inch. In my mind, 1/10 of an inch isn't a consequential change, but it is a change nonetheless.
Are there any other possible changes that you might associate with this project besides the storm you just referenced?
No, not that are substantive. I mean, yeah, there's an infinite amount of minor changes in an infinite number of locations, but in my mind, they're all negligible or insubstantial.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Reardon.
Mr. Reed, let me just ask you this. There has been a suggestion from time to time, and I think I took a quick peek at what Mr. Corcoran sent to us today, and it seemed to have a continue in a particular question, and that was, why haven't you done, or do you need to do groundwater modeling? And what's your response to that?
I mean, that was the whole point behind this memo. And I think I stated this earlier. There's a certain amount in my mind of analysis paralysis that we're bludgeoning an issue with overly complicated tools and then complaining that the inputs that we have are not as developed as they need to be. When I question whether the tools are necessary. I think we've got really good tools to use that allow us to draw conclusions that are fundamentally sound. And that's what my memo was attempted to do.
If you could just, and maybe this has happened, maybe people have done this before, but exactly what is groundwater modeling? I understand it's a different kind of tool, but what is it and what does it tell you?
I mean, as you can imagine, we civil engineers, we deal with water usually flowing through a pipe or through a channel, which is pretty simple in comparison to water flowing through soil. So water flowing through soil has a whole bunch of other factors that influence it. And in certain applications, it becomes really acute to understand how things are going to change and where they're going to end up. So for example, I work with a lot of people that do contamination transport. So if you get oil in the groundwater, it's really important to try and understand where that's going to go, how fast it's going to get there, when it's going to get there. And you've got these really, really, really powerful tools that help you figure, but they require complicated inputs, which in this case, I think we're chasing sort of an apparition that there's an answer out there that we're looking for, and that if we put enough information in, we'll get that answer. I just don't see us getting there. But the model is usually to try and figure out, okay, what's happening underneath the ground. The other reason we use it is, for example, when we have like a wastewater application. So say this was a Title V system or a septic system instead of a sewer system. You'd have water that comes into the site from the water system, right? So a whole new source of water that didn't exist prior is now getting introduced in through the septic system. This is where the models become really, really good because it's a whole new water source. It's not precipitation anymore. It happens every day. It's usually pretty much the same discharge every day. So you can put them into models and have a lot more confidence that the end result is going to reflect the conditions that you're actually going to see because the application is so consistent and so predictable. With stormwater, it's anything but that, and it's not a new source of water. So the changes are far more subtle.
Okay, that's helpful. Does anyone else have questions for Mr.
Mr.
Reardon?
Chair, if I may, before we move on from your question that you just raised, and not to disagree in any way with anything that Mr. Reardon just said, our expert groundwater mounting analysis prepared by Dr. Rosine does, the second round does contain a groundwater modeling analysis. And he's on the call tonight. He's not been made a panelist, but he's available to discuss that if you'd like to go into detail. And he's also been sending me messages and can go into further detail if you'd like, Mr. Brown, with respect to your question about impacts to offsite water sources. Up to the board's pleasure, depending on the level of detail that you'd like to go into on this issue, but we're certainly prepared to go into that level of detail.
Well, I'd be happy to hear from him. Sean, are you done for the moment?
Yeah. And
Really?
I'm a civil engineer. I'm not a hydrogeologist.
I understand.
I see myself as sort of a middleman in this dialogue. So by all means, yeah, when it comes to the more nuanced stuff, I'll definitely defer to Rob and Scott.
Okay. Well, why don't we bring him in as a panelist if we can?
Yeah, I brought him in. I've tried 3 times and this time he's on, so we're good to go.
Thank you.
Okay. It's Rob, is it?
Yes. Dr. Rosine, would you mind coming on camera?
Yeah. Good evening. Hi, everybody. This is Robert Rosine.
Good evening. So you've been listening to Sean Reardon's testimony this evening, and I understand that you had some comments to share with us.
Yeah. Basically that. Mr. Reardon did a very nice job of kind of explaining what I think we got into in discussion in the last ZBA hearing, as well as a lot of what was done in the reanalysis that we submitted for, I believe it was last week. We submitted a second, essentially a revised report that's dated, I believe it's February 18th or February 17th or thereabouts. Right. And that included essentially the same items that Mr. Reardon just discussed. And the reason that the report was revised is we were answering kind of some different questions. The initial model, the initial study was looking really just at groundwater mounding underneath the infiltration systems, but the conversation morphed into what's going to be the resulting impact with a 100-year storm, et cetera, et cetera. So went back to do that and essentially did it in many respects in the same exact way that Mr. Reardon did, using the HydroCAD for the balances, the water balance pre and post, but then applied that to a groundwater model. So essentially took the same data. It's not the exact same data because it was developed slightly differently, but the same principles are exactly the same. And then use that to evaluate the questions that were posed at that last call, which were essentially, what would be the impact? What would be the existing 100-year storm elevation within the basements? What would be the 100-year storm elevation post-development, and what sort of impacts would we have? And to summarize, I mean, it's really actually, it's actually very, very similar. And Mr. Reardon's already really explained it, which is there's really two factors to consider. In a post-development situation, there's less water going into the ground. That's the very nature of development. And so for the 100-year storm, we're actually putting less water into the ground than would have occurred in a pre-developed situation, in the current situation that we're looking at. So there's that's factor number one. There's less water going into the ground. And two, in this second round of analysis, we did model the difference with the additional storage or the fill. So in the prior analysis, again, we weren't looking at that because it was a really a different purpose. But this one we modeled a situation, the pre-existing condition with the current topography, and then the proposed conditions with additional fill anywhere between 3 and 6 feet. So now you're adding additional storage. So two factors again would be less water going into the ground and 2 more storage. And those two factors really, and if you're interested, we can go into it. But those two factors demonstrate that there's lower water surface elevations at the surrounding properties as well as on site. Which, you know, from a simplistic mass balance approach, as Mr. Reardon's just kind of reviewed, this is exactly what you would expect. And the difference being the groundwater model provides that information in a very detailed fashion.
Thank you. Ted or Mike, do you have any questions for Ted?
No.
Okay. Okay, well, I mean, this has been helpful. Ned, it would seem logical to me at this point, and maybe I should welcome anyone's thoughts on this, to hear from Scott Horsley at this point, and keeping in mind that we haven't looked at his report, or certainly I haven't, but just to get some of his thoughts. And I mean, I expect this conversation to continue next week, because I think it's a very important issue, and I want to fully understand it before, or as best I can understand it before we close the public hearing. So I think it will take up much of the agenda for next week, but I think it would be helpful, since it's just heard from both of these experts. It would be helpful to get his take on this, and then we can read his written material over the next few days, and then come back to it again next Tuesday. So if that works for everyone else, I'd kind of like to hear from Mr. Horsley.
I agree with that, Mr. Chair. I would just preface it by saying that we've just gotten barely enough time to do a cursory review of the materials that were filed in the middle of last week. And it's going to take us more time to dig into it. So
I understand that. I made that point for us too. I mean, right. we need to dig into it as well. I understand that. So but we'll have your people will have a week to do that, and that should be fine. But I'd like to at least preliminarily hear from Scott tonight, because I know he did file some materials. I just haven't had a chance to read them yet.
And I know he's ready, and I know he's ready to do that, and he is.
Okay. Why don't we hear from Mr. Horsley?
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr.
Scott, are you on?
Yeah, I am. Can you hear me?
I can. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you for letting me speak briefly tonight. I did not file any written materials. The only thing I filed was some slides, which I would like to show if I could do that, which I think might help explain some of my points. I guess I can share my screen here. And maybe what I'll do is start by saying, just to respond, I think we're all interested in the same thing here, to try to get to the bottom of this and really make it understandable. So I'm certainly sensitive to trying to simplify things so that they're understandable. However, I think it's also, we have to be careful not to oversimplify and maybe not take into account some important factors. And I guess I would just say at the outset that we've talked about this a lot. I think the decision was made to develop a groundwater model. ModFlow is the
industry standard model that has been utilized. It's very, as Sean said, I agree with him, it's very powerful. And I think going back to Michael Brown's questions, which were excellent questions, and he's absolutely right, and I'll just differ a little bit with Mr. Reardon, and that is I do believe there will be different impacts at different locations, which I kind of sense was part of Mr. Brown's question. And the nice thing about ModFlow is if it's run, set up properly and with the right receptors, those questions can be answered. In fact, that's really a real large value of doing that model, because it provides not only sort of oversight-wide numbers like the ones that we heard from tonight, but also geographically specific changes at various locations. So we can see all that. And I think, frankly, I think that's pretty important. And I'll also say that Mr. Mobile can't be here tonight. I think you have a letter from him. He and I have been collaborating quite a bit on this project. And I know that he has some, I think, some really important questions and concerns about the model. Models are typically iterative. They do commonly take more than 1 or 2 rounds. And I think it's very helpful to have 2 or 3 modelers looking at it and exchanging ideas. And while some might view this as maybe an unnecessary process, I think if we're going to try to answer questions like the ones Mr. Brown asked and some of the questions last week, I think the model has to be, at a certain level of accuracy to answer those questions. And I think that we feel we're not there yet, but we'd love to work with Rob and others. Perhaps if there are other modeling experts that could be brought to bear on this, a third party perhaps to look at it, we could probably make some progress pretty quickly. But we're doing this on a number of other projects, and it works pretty well. So having said that, let me just walk through these slides quickly. What we did is create, this is obviously a map of the site plan, and we've taken a cross section, which is identified here by these arrows through the site, to kind of look at some of the groundwater model results to date. And this next slide shows across that cross section, and you can see it's running on the left, which would be kind of the western side. That you can see the stream over here, and then this surface would represent the existing site level, and then the shaded blue, would be the water table, and the land surface data and the water table data come directly from the data provided by the groundwater model. This is the estimated high groundwater condition under existing conditions. I believe the recharge rate that was used was 4.7 inches to develop this model. We're also showing some locations of some test pits here. Now I will I'll use this slide to make one of the points that I wanted to make in response to what I've heard so far tonight. And one thing that I always tell my students, and I'll probably tell them again this Friday, be careful using the terms infiltration and recharge, because they're very different. They're not equal. In fact, infiltration is usually significantly less than recharge. So recharge is the amount, and I'll just define those. Infiltration is the amount of water that goes into the land surface, into the soil. Recharge is that amount that makes it to the water table. And the reason I wanted to mention that in this slide, because we see some trees here. And there's a lot of evapotranspiration that takes place. In fact, on average, on a year in a site like this, we might expect close to 50%, half of the annual rainfall to be taken up via evapotranspiration, which is obviously water that's not going to get into the groundwater. That water, by the way, that evapotranspiration is water that does, much of it is water that infiltrates into the soils and wets them. And of course, the trees grow from that soil moisture. So that's a really important component in the hydrologic budget. And obviously, when we go to post-development on this site, because there is so much clearing and so much impervious surface, we're going to lose that evapotranspiration. So there's a lot more water on the site to deal with. And the developer has a choice of either directing that into stormwater runoff or into infiltration and recharge. And in this case, our understanding and our belief is, and again, we differ on this with what we've heard tonight, we believe in post-development conditions, and I'll go to the next slide. There's a lot more water going into the subsurface, and we'd love to have the opportunity to talk about this in some detail. I mean, maybe that can happen. But in any case, this is also a cross-section from the modeling results. We're now seeing the original land surface, and then in the darker shading, this is the area of fill. Obviously, some of the buildings, the test pit locations. This level here is the estimated seasonal high groundwater elevations from the groundwater model. And then this level that I'll just point to, and I'm assuming you can see my cursor here, is the results of the model for the 100-year storm. So what we see from this, and I've highlighted this, is that we are getting breakout in this land surface, which means the groundwater table is coming from this position, which is subsurface. And I should also mention, according to the site plan, this is the beginning of the wetland, the jurisdictional wetland. So the vegetated wetland would actually run from that line to the stream. And then the stream is actually a wetland itself. So there are actually two different wetland types, but this is the sort of closest wetland boundary to the project site. So what we're seeing is on this slope and within the wetland, we are seeing breakout. Breakout means groundwater coming out of the ground, much like a spring would occur under a natural condition. But in this case, it's a condition that's being caused by the additional water being put into the subsurface. Interestingly, we didn't notice this before, but looking at the cross-section, we're also seeing breakout on the other side of the site. This light blue line represents, again, the modeled groundwater level as part of the 100-year storm. And you can see this is the property line. So this is something that, frankly, we just noticed when we put these cross-sections together. I'm not sure if the applicant's aware of this or not. In terms of the model results showing this, we're happy to double check this with them if they have questions about what was done here. All these surfaces came directly from the site plans and the groundwater model results. So there's two areas of breakout that I think deserve some more attention. Again, according to Mike Mobile's review, we feel the model's not there yet in terms of all the right inputs. He did write a detailed letter. I think there were 10 or 12 points. According to Dr. Mobile, only 2 of them have been responded to date. And those responses raise additional questions. So we're hoping that at least, given all the work that's been done, that we can at least have the dialogue to get answers to those questions. And again, I don't want to speak for Dr. Mobile, he'll be here next week, but he has some serious concerns about the current status of the model in terms of it accurately reflecting results. But in any case, what I'm showing you here are the results. And even with the model operating as is, there are some important things to think about and to look at, because these are obviously of concern. My note down the bottom is a comment that I made, I think at least once, if not twice, in my prior comment letters. And again, this is maybe where we differ from what we heard tonight. We do believe that the annual recharge rate on the site is significantly increased. Just going back to this first slide, this is the value that I believe that was used in the existing conditions model. So of the 40 some odd inches that Sean mentioned per year, about only 4.7 is reaching the groundwater as recharge. I would guess that a lot more of that is infiltrating the surface, but again, it's being removed via evapotranspiration. By removing these trees, we're actually, and the evapotranspiration, we're actually adding back into the equation about half of the annual precipitation, another 20 inches to deal with. So our feeling is that post-development, this condition here, that the net recharge rate on the site is going up somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 inches or more compared to the 4.7. And logically, if that's true, then the water table is going to come up as a result of that, which really would be a separate condition from what we're seeing in this modeling result, because this is the 100-year storm. What we're saying is, even before the 100-year storm, there will be a rise in water table due to the increase in annual recharge rate. And again, we can come back and talk more details there. I just have a couple more slides, Mr. Chairman, and these will respond to, again, some things we heard this evening. This is a table from the revised modeling report. And I believe what they did, and I've highlighted the numbers here, and I've written on the right some notes. I believe what they've done is taken their annual rainfall, and you can see there are two columns here. One is entitled HydroCAD and one is entitled ModFlow. The difference, I think, is the 7.96 acres represents the project site. The 13, I believe, represents the modeling domain, meaning that the ModFlow model was actually slightly larger than the site. So that's why we have two columns here, I believe. I'm not sure of this, but I think that's the case. In any case, what they've done is indicated the amount of rainfall, which is simply taking the 8.36 inches storm that Sean mentioned earlier times the surface area, and that's the volume of rainfall you get from the 100-year storm. They've then taken the HydroCAD results, which I agree with what Sean said. It's a very good model to estimate surface runoff results, and those are these numbers here. They've then subtracted these two values and arrived at these numbers here. And it's being called recharge, but I believe this is an infiltration number. And again, we can spend more time debating or providing plenty of references on the difference between infiltration and recharge. I think if you take rainfall and you subtract runoff, you get infiltration. And as my note says at the bottom, the difference is that it doesn't account for what happens to that water once it's infiltrated into the subsurface. As I've indicated earlier, not all of it makes it to the groundwater. Not all of it becomes groundwater recharge. And I do have one last slide that hopefully will illustrate this a little bit. This is a cross section from a soil science manual. And what it does is portrays obviously the surface of the land at the top here. And then the term deep percolation is something that's used in soil science, which really equals groundwater recharge. So this is where the water table is down here. And so this area of soil from the land surface to the groundwater system is what we call the unsaturated zone. And that's the area which this infiltrated water moves through. But as you can see in this slide, what happens is, and if you think of watering your houseplant, might be a good analogy here. When you pour water into your houseplant, unless you pour too much, it doesn't come flowing out the bottom. It stays in the soil. Hot water you pour in there, just what it does is it makes the soil wetter, if I can just use that term. That's called soil moisture. The amount of water that given the soil can hold without recharging is something called field capacity. So those numbers are available. I started to do some calculations for this site, which perhaps we can look at in the future, but I can tell you that it is a significant number. And so the difference between the amount of water that's infiltrated and recharge is substantial. Now, one reaction to this might be, well, what happens during growing season versus non-growing season? And that's a good question. So during the growing season, that soil moisture is taken up by plants. During the non-growing season, there's still soil moisture that stays there for a period of time until the next storm, could be a week later, could be 2 weeks later, which then exceeds the field capacity and gets to a level where then that water gets into the groundwater as recharge. So then in that case, it becomes a timing issue. And if we're looking at the event, the 100-year event, that's something that happens over this 72-hour period that has been modeled. And what I'm suggesting here is that this calculation that was used back here to estimate the amount of recharge, I'm not sure, I think it's a bit of an oversimplification of how much of the rainfall during the 100-year storm gets into the groundwater. I think that, and this will depend on what's called antecedent soil conditions, meaning what the moisture level is in the soils. But again, when we do this modeling, and I agree with Sean, we need to make assumptions in models. So here we need to be conservative and look at a range of conditions, soil moisture conditions. But I think you'll find if we do this, you'll be surprised at how much of this infiltration becomes soil moisture and not recharge. So I think that's another consideration here. And I think that's the last slide I have. Yes, it is. So I will stop sharing there and see if there are any questions from the board.
Jen, Mike, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I have a couple, if it's okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Horsley. So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you indicated at one point that removing the trees from the site, did you say it was like adding back half of the annual precipitation into the equation? Is that a generally accepted number, or is it based on the number, the density of the trees, I would presume, or the number of trees on the site?
Yes, that's about right. Just to put numbers on that, if the rainfall is, let's say, 45 inches per year, depending on the forest cover on this site, I think it'd be reasonable to assume something like 20 to 24 inches of evapotranspiration on an annual basis. So when you remove those trees, I should mention, there's something called net precipitation. So if you take 45 inches, let's just call the evapotranspiration 20 inches. 45 minus 20 means you've got 25 inches of net precipitation to deal with on the site. And that either becomes surface runoff or infiltration. And then some of the infiltration might become runoff, okay? Recharge. But in the post-development conditions, when you remove the trees, you don't have the evapotranspiration loss. So you're back to close to the 45 inches of rainfall to deal with in terms of volume of water on the site. So I hope that answered your question.
I think so. I mean, am I getting this like totally wrong? The trees are they like a form of storage to a certain extent? Pre-development storage for the water, the trees soak it up, or?
I'm not sure I don't think I'd use the term sewage, but yes, that's a good way.
No, not sewage. I said storage.
Oh, storage. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I misunderstood. I apologize.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
I misunderstood you. Yeah, well, yes, absolutely. That's a good way to look at it.
I mean, it's obviously different, but okay. So,
Yeah.
So you're saying that it reduces the, or it, I guess reduces the mitigating effect of this, of the post-development storage tanks, because you're taking away something that was there before the development. Is that?
Yeah, that's right. And frankly,
Okay.
that's one of the reasons why I'm teaching a course right now called Low Impact Development Green Infrastructure. And this is, I know Rob knows a lot about this, Sean knows a lot about this. This is something that we're promoting nationally. And the idea is really to keep a lot of trees in place or replace a lot of vegetation, in part to balance this hydrologic budget. We're now realizing that we've had a lot of site development that has impacted the hydrologic budget significantly. And there are techniques of site development where this can be mitigated, but I don't believe this project does that. I think this project is, I would certainly not qualify this project as an LID example, a low impact development example, and in part because of these hydrologic changes.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions.
Mike, did you have any questions?
Yes, very quickly, Mr. Horsley, thanks for your presentation. So the applicant's mounding analysis included models that are standard in the industry and performed according to the Massachusetts stormwater regulations. Why wouldn't the industry standards and the Massachusetts stormwater regulations include the things that you just mentioned in your presentation regarding the trees and the removal of vegetation and things like that?
Actually, I believe they do indirectly. As Sean was mentioning earlier, I agree with his assessment that the standards are very good. Now, one of the first comments that I made in my first comment letter is this project is proposing to infiltrate and recharge significantly more water than the standard stormwater standard number 3, which is designed to match the existing hydrology. That was one of my first comments. First thing I saw in the stormwater report. And this is being now translated, if we looked at this closer, going from like a 4.7 inch recharge rate to something on the order of 20 inches. And it's because I think this, if I could, I think Sean's approach was great to try to boil this down very simply. So let me try to do it using his approach to answer your question. And that is, we start out with 45 inches of water. Naturally, almost half of that is lost due to evapotranspiration. We take that out of the equation. Now we have a lot more water to deal with. And the applicant really has two choices on how to deal with it. One is more surface runoff leaving the site, and they can't do that because of standard 2, or put more water in the ground, more than existing. And that is what they're proposing here, in my opinion. Now, the stormwater standards don't specifically say you can't do that. However, they do say that in other places you should preserve and match the existing recharge rate. So, without getting into great detail, I think these principles are in the standards. By the way, one of the other standards is to utilize low impact development design principles. That's one of the other principles that's in this mass stormwater standards. And I'm not sure that's been complied with here either, but it is in the standards.
Thank you.
Anyone have any questions? Members of the public, anybody that's
I gotta go.
Mr. Hurley, if I could, just real
Yeah,
quick.
Sean, yeah.
I just want to clarify something real quick.
Okay.
So evapotranspiration is two things. It's transpiration and evaporation. So evaporation is just water evaporating off of a surface. So under no circumstances is anything on the project going to eliminate evapotranspiration. There's still going to be trees. There's still going to be evaporation. What I asked is if Mr. Horsley could prepare something that quantified this number, because without a quantification of what we're talking about, it's hard to put it in terms of whether it's impactful or not. And I struggle a bit when he puts things in perspective of eliminating evapotranspiration when that in fact is not what is happening. So it's borderline misleading, and I just want to make sure it's clear on this.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, that's a fair point, Sean. I did say eliminate. Let me change that to very significantly reduce. And if I had to put a number to it, on the order of 80 to 90% reduction. So it's not 100%, you're correct. But, and I'd say the way you could estimate that is looking at the area of vegetation pre and post. And I could, maybe it's 75 or 80%. I'm not sure the exact number, but it's the majority. Maybe take a step back from that. Could we agree that the majority of vegetation is not going to be there post-development that is now? No, okay. Well, I guess we can't make any progress.
We've had this conversation. We don't agree.
Okay.
Put it in
So
writing.
it's the same number of vegetation, same number of vegetation pre and post. Okay.
But we get a lot more evaporation off the
We can
pavement.
look at
than
the
we do off
site plan.
grass.
We can look at the site plans. I think it's a substantial loss in trees. I don't know what the number is.
So then what I'd ask Scott is if you can put it in a memo, quantifying why it's of a magnitude,
Sure.
where the number comes from, and how it's impactful. Rather than sort of say why the work that the applicant has done or the work that I've done is incomplete, put forward your own numbers so that we can evaluate on the basis of that knowledge.
Sure thing.
Mr. Chair, if I may, and not to cut you off, Mr. Reardon, we have some comments we'd like to make in response to this. And not to disagree with starting from the first thing Mr. Horsley said, but the first thing I wrote down in my notes that he said was that we're all interested in the same thing. And with respect to him, I disagree with that. I don't think that he is seeking the same thing as we are in this, which is to reach a scientific solution to this and to get to the bottom of what these issues actually are. Mr. Horsley has appeared before this board a number of times and offered misleading testimony. And what he offered to the board just now was nothing short of misleading. I would ask him to go back to the share screen and specifically to the cross section that he showed that was labeled post-development groundwater mounding. And I believe Dr. Rosine has some specific questions he'd like to ask Mr. Horsley about that.
Let me get to the right slide.
why doesn't he just, I'd rather not there be a direct dialogue between the two. Why don't you just ask the questions and then the board can ask Mr. Horsley to answer, to address them.
Sure. And actually, Mr. Chair, if you would allow, what I would rather do would be just pull up a few slides that we had prepared on our own, just to answer it a bit more directly.
Anything that you think will make it easier for us to understand would be appreciated.
Okay, thank you. So prior to that, one thing I'd like to point out is just in response to the idea that evapotranspiration is a significant loss. One of the things that is really important to understand is the scope of the question that was asked. We were not asked for an annual water budget. I would agree with Mr. Horsley if we were talking about an annual water budget, then maybe we would be talking about 80% loss. But remember what the scope of the question was. What is the impact during a 100-year storm? And it is routine, it is an industry standard that nobody measures evapotranspiration during a storm. Why is that? Because it's raining. Evapotranspiration does not occur while it's raining. You've got, the rain is falling from the sky. Evapotranspiration occurs when the sun's out, it's stopped raining, and now the trees are wicking moisture out of the ground. So it is very misleading to suggest that evapotranspiration is, or the lack of it in the groundwater model is misrepresenting the volumes by as much as 80%. I would agree if we were talking about an annual water budget, in which case we're talking about small storms, big storms, et cetera. But that's not what we were tasked with doing. What we were tasked with doing was what's the evaluation of the 100-year storm, and that's essentially what is occurring within a 24 to 48 hour period. So with that, I'm going to share my screen here real briefly, and I'm going to try and be sensitive to not make this an academic back and forth, because I don't think anybody needs that. But what I want you to understand is the level of rigor that has been, in my opinion, the level of rigor that has been used in this model is appropriate. The fact that there are assumptions about lack of evapotranspiration, et cetera, it's routine within models to make assumptions, and we commonly describe it as the mark of a good modeler is not to overcomplicate a model unnecessarily, right? You make it as simple as necessary to explain what it is that you need to do. So just real quickly. So this was one of the tables that we used, and this was essentially, and Mr. Horsley described this already, and this is essentially the same analysis that Sean, or very similar to what Sean did, and that is correct to say that we have two different scale of models. We have a HydroCAD model, which is the site area, but then we had a groundwater model, which is a much larger area, so 13 acres or so. So that had to be scaled. But what doesn't change with that is that we know, and you can see this both in the HydroCAD model as well as in the ModFlow model, that we have a net reduction for the 100-year storm of essentially 41,000 cubic feet, or about 0.9 acre feet. And that's for the 100-year storm. That information has been submitted both already with, I believe it was in the November stormwater report. And that was the basis for which this type of analysis was done. So I think the most important part I want to point out here is in our the last meeting, there's a lot of discussion about the potential for storage, and you can see here what we have is the red line here. This is a cross section across through the middle of the site. The red line is the existing grade of the proposed site. And then the dark black line on above that is the proposed grade. So you can see the additional storage that would be provided from all the various materials. So if I were to go back to just the quick summary of what I'd mentioned before, there's less water going into the ground, which really nobody's arguing about, because that's what the HydroCAD model shows. It's what the basics of hydrology would tell us. That you combine that with additional storage, you have a site that is greater able to retain this. So I'm going to skip this for a moment, but what I want to show you here is, so this is very similar to the model that we showed in the prior weeks. One of the differences being that we added additional test pits that we hadn't used prior because they weren't really necessary, because again, we were focusing on a slightly different question before. But so we involved all the test pits. This reduced our error. Our error is even less now. I think we're down around 2%. Before we'd been around 4.5% or something. But what I want to show you is this is the 100-year storm in the current conditions. So what's important to understand about this, the blue is breakout. And why this is important for us to show this is because one of the slides that we saw from Mr. Horsley showed breakout on the front and back. And that's true, there is for sure breakout. But what's important to understand is the reduced breakout. So we have to compare apples to apples in this. So why would you expect to see this type of breakout in an existing condition? Well, we hear this all the time from the abutters that this is an area that has water problems. We have shallow depth to groundwater. There's not a lot of storage. There's 18 to 24 inches before the seasonal high. So it really isn't surprising at all. And if you go back to the prior, what you see is the breakout that would occur down in the wetland areas that you would expect to see. These are the very wet areas where we know the wetlands are. So this seems to be modeling pretty well what we know, what we've observed in the field. So this would be the expected 100-year. And then this is now the proposed 100-year. So if we just toggle back and forth real quickly, you can see the amount of blue is greatly reduced. And if you pick a cross section, which I'm presuming that the cross section that Mr. Horsley picked was probably this cross section here, that showed breakout on the back of the site. Yes, there is breakout on the back of the site. Yes, there's breakout on the front of the site, but is there reduced breakout? And the answer to that is absolutely. You have a much larger sponge, you have less water going into the ground. And I think that's probably, with the exception of this, the last piece we really need to cover. I don't want to go into too much depth because we'll just we'll do it as necessary if you'd like. But what the new analysis shows, you may recall in the last meeting we had with Mr. Reardon and I were discussing about depth of groundwater in the basements of the abutters. And what I want, this is for the three adjacent parcels that we talked about prior. Orange is the ground surface, and blue would be the 100-year storm. Black would be the 100-year storm after post-development, and then yellow would be your seasonal high groundwater. And in the case of Canton Avenue, of 640 Canton Avenue, where we have a reduction of about 1.8 feet in groundwater surface, which again makes perfect sense. More storage, less water in the ground. At 656, where this is in an area where breakout's not observed, breakout would be observed if you saw this water level go above the ground surface, which it's not in this location. But in the same instance, we see a lowering of groundwater by about a foot. And then at 654, this would be a location where breakout occurs both before and after in the proposed and pre-existing conditions, and a lowering of groundwater by about 0.9, approximately 1 foot. So with that, I think that's probably a good place to leave it. I don't want to overcomplicate things by getting into discussions about turf flow, evaporation, recharge, infiltration. Those are all very important concepts. But in the instance of examining a 24-hour storm, which is what occurs for a 100-year storm, we're generally speaking, the standard of practice is you neglect evapotranspiration during those periods of time. Okay, that's probably a good point to stop and see if anybody has any questions.
Mike, Ted, anyone else?
I have a question. Mr. Rosine, I'm glad we're not in the same room because you might reach across the table and strangle me after you hear this question. Why should I be concerned with a 100-year storm? And so I'm a layperson who has my own backyard to deal with.
Yeah.
And what concerns me is a small storm that happens every afternoon for 2 weeks. Or, a couple of storms that happen in March when the ground is still frozen and water does weird things and gets into the basement and stuff like that. That's the perspective I'm looking at this from. And I'm sure your model is, excellent and all that stuff, but I don't understand the first order of this analysis, which is why are we looking at the 100-year storm? I understand 100-year storm is probably the worst case scenario, and that's a good place to start. But practically speaking, if I'm a neighbor, I'm going to be concerned not with something that's hypothetical and probably never going to happen, but with what actually does happen. And there are lots of different events that cause different water issues in different ways. So that's what I'm trying to understand.
Sure. No, it's a great question. And I think the simple answer is that this, and you basically said it already, this is a worst case scenario. So in this instance, we would expect, if it's that much better, for the smaller storms, we would expect it to be even better. That type of analysis would be very easy to do. It would just be additional layers. But generally speaking, we will often look at just the largest storm as a measure, as our most conservative measure, meaning that what I'm demonstrating here as an improvement, you would expect to see that and then some for say the smaller, more average storms. The smaller, more average storms, where those really matter, which is, and this is where Mr. Horsley and I would really agree on this, is that where the smaller storms matter is those are the sort of the routine storms. Those are the ones that where the issues of infiltration versus recharge versus evapotranspiration, they do tend to matter more. But what we do know is that what we've taken here is a worst case scenario. So it's you're not going to see anything. You're not going to have an instance where the storage is going to be the storage or the groundwater elevations are going to be exacerbated any more than what is already occurring in this instance.
And that includes multiple storms back to back.
Yeah.
Over. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions from anyone in the audience or otherwise?
We have the audience. Lara?
I'm sorry?
Can we stop sharing screen so people can be
Right.
seen?
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi,
Yeah.
can people hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great, thank you. Laura Roach, 44 Holmes Lane. Thanks for taking my question and comments tonight. So I guess, as a neighbor and also, a direct abutter, it's really concerning that I heard tonight some folks, particularly Mr. Reardon and Dr. Rosine, say that they feel the issue is being overcomplicated or perhaps overanalyzed. I heard the term analysis paralysis. And I think, clearly this is an extremely complex issue. It keeps coming back to the forefront of the conversation. It's a serious issue that needs to be given the time and attention that it really deserves. And in my opinion, I think most others, if that means analyzing or perhaps overanalyzing to really ensure that these neighborhoods are not flooded out, then so be it. With that said, Mr. Reardon said himself that he's a middleman here. He's not a hydrologist or an expert in mod flow analysis. And I think this really speaks to the fact that the town of Milton has not had a true peer review of the massive water issues on the site. And the town needs one. And we've been asking for one since these hearings have kicked off. And because the town doesn't have a hydrologist or a mod flow expert to do the peer review, neighbors have hired an expert in these areas. And that expert has asked the applicant for access to the file that they've shared with us. And he has not been given that access. And I just can't quite understand why that would be the case. So maybe someone can answer that for me. But, Mr. Mobile has said that it is the norm, in the industry to share files so that experts can kind of put their heads together and further analyze the inputs and outputs. So, why can't these experts have access to that analysis, to that file? It's also my understanding that Mr. Mobile has asked several questions, and I believe only 2 have been partially answered, if that. And so again, why would that be, right? Why would that be unless there was a reason that the applicant didn't want to share information that they, thought may come out of giving those answers? It just seems very strange to me that the applicant and the board would not want to have all of the information possible from all of the experts at their disposal. So that's a question. Why, don't all the parties involved want information from all the parties involved? We should be open to that. So I guess, neighbors really deserve answers to their experts' questions, and we don't have those answers that we need. And I think that a town peer review is needed here. So again, on the record, we've been asking for this since the hearings have started. And because it's a complicated issue, that's really the only way that this issue is going to be, done justice, is to have a true peer review of the hydrology of the other water issues on this site. Thank you.
Anyone else? No?
No, not right now. Yes, sorry, Mike Kelly.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm not really about to talk on the water issue. If that's appropriate or inappropriate at this time, I'm not certain. What I want to talk about is the logistics of constructing the project and the earth movement. Is that, can I speak to that issue at this point?
Sure.
Mr. Chair, I have a presentation that goes to a significant component of that as well.
You have that presentation for tonight?
It's ready to go tonight, next week, whenever it's appropriate. I've provided all those materials previously. I emailed a copy of the presentation this afternoon.
Okay. You realize you haven't seen it?
You have seen it. You've seen all the materials that are in it.
No, what you sent this afternoon?
The materials that are in the presentation were submitted previously.
Okay. We can do it tonight. We can do it next week. How long are you going to need?
15 minutes.
Oh, we can do it tonight then.
Great.
Should I continue?
Go ahead.
Now
Let's
or
go
wait?
back, Mr. Kelly. Let's go back to your question. Go ahead.
Again, I don't have a question. I have some thoughts on the logistics of the construction.
Okay.
My background, my education is in civil engineering with a background in structural, but for my entire career, I've really been in construction management. And one of the things I'm concerned about, I'd like to first give you an example. The company I work was tasked to build a 5-story top-down garage under the Harvard Law School, the new Harvard Law School on Mass Ave. So as you can imagine, we moved a lot of earth out of there. This is the side of Mass Ave, I'll say on the Arlington side of Mass Ave, where there is an island in the middle of Mass Ave. There's 2 lanes on either side, and then there's a parking lane on either side. So in reality, there's 6 lanes across. We had 12 to 14 trucks a day making 3 rounds, and we took the entire parking lane on the side that we were on in order that the trucks could back up and continuously maneuver through the site. My understanding on this site is to fill the earth. I've worked on $100 million, $200 million projects in 20 years ago, so they probably be quite a bit more now. But the point is, I've never seen so much earth brought into a site. But with that said, my understanding is that it's going to take 60 loads per day. When they say 60 loads, they're talking about 60 trailer dumps, not a Mack truck, not a triaxle dump, which is like your typical Mack truck. This is a trailer dump. This is the size of a tractor trailer truck without a roof on it. Now, in order to turn those into the site, I don't know how you would do that. You'd probably have to swing into the other lane just to turn into the site. At the same time, you'd have trucks leaving sites. So when you say 60 loads in there a day, that means 60 loads, 60 trucks coming out during the day. So that means 120 trailer dumps going up and down Canton Ave between Reedsdale Road and Blue Hills Parkway a day. Now, I've lived here for 23 years, and I can't picture the last time, if ever, I've seen a tractor trailer truck going up that area of Canton Ave in either direction. So again, with all of this said, my point is, if you brought some construction people in there and maybe the zoning board isn't concerned with the logistics of the construction, that's, you know, something else. I can send, I see all this water that you're going through that takes tests and qualifications, meets a very specific guideline or level or whatever the case may be. But I suggest to you that if I brought some intelligent construction people that actually build things in here and asked them, how am I going to get 60 trucks in there a day? I'd like to loan to you, that's a simple question. You can think about that. How are you going to get 60 trucks in there a day down Canton Ave? I would loan to you that we had 12 to 14 trucks, 20 trucks at 3 rounds. To get 20 trucks in a construction season on one site is a difficult thing. To get 38 to 50,000 cubic yards of good soil is a logistically difficult thing. You'd have to have police, detour signs. And as I say all this, I don't think logistically you can do it. You'd have to shut down half of Canton Ave. You just couldn't get them in there. And then if you said, well, we won't do 60 trucks a day, we'll do half of that. So it'll take, instead of 3 months, it'll take 6 months. Well, that's fine, but if you can't bring enough soil in there and you've got a bulldozer, a gradle, a backhoe, and a front end loader moving earth, and they sit still because they have nothing to do because you can't bring enough dirt to them, then it becomes cost prohibitive. It just becomes silly. And the trucks that make the rounds, if they can't make 3 rounds a day, they can't make money. And they want to charge you extra. We're only making 1 round a day. We ain't making any money. So it's, what I'm getting across to you is, think about it. Drive down that area of Canton Ave if you ain't already very familiar with it. And say to yourself, how am I going to get 120 tractor trailers up and down Canton Ave every day? You know, the first thing that a logistical person would say, well, we'll do it at night. We'll do it overnight. Well, I can tell you right now, in the middle of Harvard Square, they wouldn't let us do it overnight. And there wasn't very residential there. So I'm just loaning to you that this project from the start is logistically bizarre. You can't queue trucks. These trucks back up. You go coming onto a site, you'll have, if you have 20 trucks, you'll have half of them backed up waiting to get on the site. You'll have 10 trucks backed up on Canton Ave. You can't do that. And maintain Canton Ave. You have to shut down Canton Ave in that area. You know, anything, if you want to spend money, anything's possible. Maybe they could have a helicopters fly it in and dump it in here. So I hope my thought is a little more simplistic than the hydrology.
Right. Well, it's a thought that I can only speak for myself. It's always been on my mind with respect to this application. I don't have construction experience, but I have a common sense view of how difficult this is going to be.
Not to be an interrupter, but my last point is 120 trailer dumps a day will not be the only vehicles coming in and off the site. I already described to you bulldozers, front end loaders, backhoes, mechanics coming in to fix them, bringing in equipment to repair them.
It's a point I don't think that's lost on any of us. But I appreciate your reiterating it.
Thank you.
Bev, who else would like to speak?
Yes, Kristen?
Okay.
Good evening, Kristen Repa. I live at 654 Canton Avenue, directly across the street from 652. I just want to take a few moments. I don't have a lot of time this evening, so I appreciate just a few moments. My question is for the, in regards to the hydraulics and the, the infiltration of the water and the recharging of the water. My main question only is, does this saving of the water that goes into these systems then prohibit the water from going into the wetlands? So basically, what is the impact on the wetlands? Do the wetlands, now that we've heard all the information regarding how moist the soil is, remove the trees, those details, I don't want to go into all those details again, but how does the water going into these basins, these catch basins for a simplistic term, how does that affect then how the rest of the wetlands that are surrounding are affected? So do we run the risk of losing our amphibians, our salamanders, our frogs? Will those go away because now the land is not as moist anymore because now all that water is going into these basins?
Sean, is that a question you can address?
Yeah, sure. And this is the whole purpose for the stormwater standards. So the reason we have volumes and volumes of books on managing stormwater is to prevent these kind of things from happening. So from my perspective, if the applicant demonstrates compliance with the standards, which were developed with the intention of mitigating such impacts, then they've demonstrated that they're not creating such an impact. Now, Scott may argue that there are changes, but I have to go back to standards and very specific requirements, and that's what I hold the applicant to.
Okay. Bev, anyone else on
Yes,
board?
Lara is back on.
Who? I'm sorry.
Lara, I'm sorry, Lara. Roche.
Okay.
Yes, that's me. I'm back. So I guess I had within my comments, there were several questions, and I think that I really didn't get any answers to that questions. There were no responses. So I'd like to ask my questions again and perhaps get some answers to them. So the first being regarding the mod flow analysis file. Why hasn't the applicant been willing to share that file? And more explicitly, will they share the file with Mr. Mobile? Why isn't the board asking for that file to be shared, and perhaps will the board ask for that file? So I'll ask for answers to those questions, and I have a few more.
Okay. I can only put that to the applicant. Is there any reason not to share that file?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to answer that question. I was making note of it and planning to come back to it. The answer to your question, Ms. Roach, is no. We will not be sharing that proprietary data. It is not industry standard to provide that data. In fact, it's rarely, if ever, done. I'm not aware of any instance in which that kind of data is shared.
It's currently being shared in Weston, actually. So it seems though that it may be more the norm than maybe you're aware, but it's currently being shared in Weston, just as a heads up.
Well, through you again, Mr. Chair, I'm glad you brought that up, the Weston hearing, Ms. Roach, because I would invite the members to take a look at the website for the Weston Zoning Board of Appeals to see who in that case has filed letters. And I think you'll see some familiar names, among them Scott Horsley, John Chesia, and Michael Mobile, who have filed letters and materials that are surprisingly similar to what they filed in this case. That is part and parcel of the reason why, to answer your question, Ms. Roach, we will not be providing this data, because as I mentioned in response to Mr. Horsley tonight, their intent in this is not the same as ours. Their intent is to create confusion and to use the analysis, the data that we have provided to the board for their benefit and for Mr. Reardon's benefit to resolve these issues within the requirements of the law. Their intent is to use that data against us. And that is exactly what they are doing tonight in Weston.
Mr. Chair, that's just absurd. And I would ask Mr. Shannon to take that back. That is a mischaracterization and misrepresentation of what my consultants are doing. They're seeking the truth, and they're being denied access to materials that would help them get at the truth.
Well, I don't want to have a debate about this. He's made his position clear. I sort of agree with the member of the public who asked the question that if the data would shed some light on what is seemingly a pretty complicated subject and would aid the board in reaching a decision, then it would be, I can't order you to produce it, but it would be a nice thing if you did. I'm really not sure what that data shows, that it is so confidential, but it even leads me to wonder what it is. But anyway, that's your decision to make, whether or not you share the data. Obviously, I don't have the power to compel you to do that, but it does, I think, leave a cloud over things that it's not being shared. And if I lived next door and I were a member of the public, I know I'm a member of the public, but if I lived next door, I'd be puzzled myself as to why that data wouldn't be shared. So, but that's the applicant's choice to make, and it's something that will be factored into the ultimate analysis, I guess.
Thank you, Chairman Hurley. I guess then my another question from my comments earlier is if, perhaps they don't want to share the model. Again, I don't understand why that would be unless they were trying to cover up something, but I think that everyone's on the same page there. If they're not willing to share that file, why can't the town have a peer review, a hydrology peer review? Is that something that can be brought on at this point? Is that something that the board can request, seeing how complicated and complex this issue is? I mean, again, as I said, Mr. Reardon said himself, he's done a wonderful job, but he's a middleman. He said it himself, he's not a hydrologist or an expert with mod flow analysis. So is that something that the board can ask for at this point? Thank you.
I think the answer to that question is yes, we could ask for it. I don't know what the town's response would be to it. We're also at the end of the public hearing time frame. So without the applicant's agreement to allow that to happen, I don't think that from a timing standpoint, I don't think we could do that. But from the applicant standpoint, though, I think they have to be concerned that to the extent that there's uncertainty and concern, that's something that gets factored into the analysis when we make our decision. This is a complicated area. Every bit of information that would be helpful to us, it would be nice if it was made available, but we'll deal with the information that we have. That's all I can say. I mean, I can't compel them to extend the time. I can't compel the town of Milton to, put any more money into this than they have already, and to engage somebody that's not within our purview to do that. Those requests can certainly be passed along, but we don't have the authority to compel them or order them to occur. Period.
Mr. Chair, if I could just add real quickly, we have plenty of hydrogeologists that can look at mod flow. The reason I use the term middleman is just as a sort of a communicator, not a sort of an impartial observer. So I was just trying to sort of bridge the gap between some very, very, very high level thinkers with specific skill sets and what I perceive as a audience that may not be. Well, I know I can't understand a lot of what they say, so it was my attempt to sort of communicate it in different terms.
I understand, and I appreciate the way you presented it, because some of it passes right through over me. I don't know about the rest of the board members, but it's complicated, and if you don't deal with this every day, it's not something you're going to grasp very quickly. The last time I took science was, at BC High in 1968, so it's been a while. But as I said, whatever information that people can bring to bear is of assistance to us. And, at the end of the day, speaking only for myself, I mean, I have concerns about water. I have concerns about what impacts this is going to have on water. I hear what people are saying. All we can do is try to evaluate the information that's presented to us. If there's another body of information that's available that would even be more helpful and deal with some of the issues and questions we might have, that would be great. But again, I can't compel that to happen. I can only assimilate and deal with the information that's presented to us. We had no input, and Mr. Reardon, I don't mean to suggest anything ill about your work, because I think it's been fabulous, but we had no input as to who would be engaged as peer reviewers, what their discipline would be. That wasn't something that we had any input in. So that's enough said on that subject. So we're going to deal with the information that we have. I think the applicant has made it clear that they're not going to provide the information that was requested by one of the members of the public. And so we'll go forward based on what we have. Mr. Eden, if you think there's somebody from your shop that, could shed some light on this next week when we continue this public hearing on some of the very specific issues that have come up tonight, then that would be great.
I'll see if I can manage that.
Great.
Just to further add, if I may, Mr. Chair, to come back to what I mentioned at the beginning of the hearing about the Conservation Commission process, it's fairly routine for the kind of peer review analysis that Ms. Roach has suggested be done in the context of that hearing. And just to reiterate that the Conservation Commission is really the board in Milton with the expertise to analyze these issues in a high level of detail that I think all of us on this call, except for maybe 3 or 4 of the folks on the call, really well beyond our level of understanding. So I recognize the concern that Ms. Roach has and the neighbors have. We're not meaning to sweep this issue under the rug. It's been subject to extensive review and analysis and will continue to be. And just by way of further suggestion, if the board does vote to approve this project, it will be subject presumably to an extensive list of conditions, one of which I would assume would be compliance with any order of conditions issued by the Conservation Commission following that peer review process. So just, I realize that this is little consolation tonight, but there is much more review of the issue of groundwater mounding and stormwater management to come.
Thank you for that. Do you have any other members of the public who wish to be heard?
Karen Walker.
Okay. Ms. Walker, good evening.
Good evening. I'm new to this endeavor here. I'm at 36 Holmes Lane. I've just been here a few months. And this may be something that's already been discussed, but I'm wondering how global warming has, and the anticipated effect of rising storm, ocean levels and so forth. Has that been part of the consideration in the predictions about water on this property? Or are we just operating on history and what the flow of water has been? And we don't really know what's going to come, but has that been any consideration in the predictions that have been made in this process?
Sean, I'll defer to you on this, but I don't think we take that into account, do we? I don't think that's been addressed.
No, it's part of the reason why we look at a wide range of storm events, because you can sort of plot a trajectory based on how the system reacts during the different storm events. There are new standards being considered right now, which basically assign larger rainfall volumes to the same storms. So the answer in a short way is, yeah, the analysis does consider it. It doesn't address it explicitly, but it does consider it.
Okay, thank you for that.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Yes.
Yeah, one other thing to consider too is this is what's being used here for infiltration and storage is essentially green infrastructure. And if you look at all the literature, green infrastructure is a big part of climate resiliency. In that specifically what it does is the fact that it manages to store and recharge groundwater is a big component of building in municipal climate resiliency. So if you were in any municipality, Boston, suburbs, wherever, as we rebuild our developed landscape, our built landscape, as a matter of routine, we're looking for practices specifically like this to help provide climate resiliency. These types of projects are the types of projects that will reduce downstream flooding versus, say, traditional projects, which would have used what we would call pipe and pond, just standard catch basins, pipes and ponds.
So I think the answer to your question, Ms. Walker, is that so within the context of the existing tools and utilizing the 100-year storm event, we've sort of indirectly dealt with the issue of global warming without specifically calling it out. I don't know how we could do it any other way than with the tools that have been employed. So I think, as Mr. Reardon said, I think we've addressed it, maybe indirectly, but I think it's been addressed with the tools that are available.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Bev, anyone else?
Yes, Robin O'Neill.
Okay, Mr. O'Neill, welcome.
Hi, it's Robin O'Neill at 30 Holmes Lane. I just had a question about water runoff and stormwater runoff with the raised elevation, with the amount of raising the level of the property, you know, for the construction and so forth, all the added fill. Like the abutters, is there going to be like, I mean, there's some runoff, obviously, even on grassy areas down the sides of hills in, you know, existing properties as it is. Is this going to increase a lot of runoff coming from the sides of this project because it is elevated so far above the abutters?
Sean, can you deal with that?
Yeah, it will not, because most of the water that runs off to your site is going to get diverted to the infiltration system. So yes, there are portions along the perimeter that are going to get a little bit steeper, which over those areas, yep, would run off a little bit quicker. But in the sort of mass balance equation, a lot of the water that would otherwise run to your property is now going into the infiltration system, into the storage system.
But if the storage systems are in the middle, how is that going to get the water away from running down the edges of this big embankment?
So if you think of it this way, let's say there used to be an acre that would run off to your property. Now there's only maybe 1/10 of an acre that would run off. So that 1/10 of an acre may run off a little bit faster, but it doesn't exceed the amount that came from the balance of the area that used to run off that no longer does.
Well, if you're raising the level though of the property, it's going to, I mean, yeah, it's going to just go off to the sides. On, you know, it's got to go some. It's not going to just sit there and run to an uphill place. It's going to go downhill.
Right, and that's what they analyze. So they analyze where all the water goes under pre-development conditions, and how much of it goes there, and then they analyze it under post-development conditions and have to design a system that mitigates that and make sure that there's no more going off the site than there currently was.
Well, like currently it runs away from my property. And then if you're going to put fill in, it's going to be higher. So it's going to run to my property along the edge. I'm not saying the entire section because of the collection things. I'm just saying if you've got this embankment in areas of this property, water's going to run down it, particularly when the ground's frozen.
Right. And Phil, I just saw Phil pop up. He can maybe speak to this a little bit more explicitly than I can. Then in those cases, then what has to happen is they have to collect that water before it goes off to your property and direct it to some other location.
The water that's hitting the side of the embankment?
Mr. Chair, I was hoping I could just jump in for a minute. Obviously, I don't think Sean needed too much of an assist. He hit the nail on the head. Just to address Ms. O'Neill's point, obviously our stormwater design is containment. So everything on the site is contained within our paved areas. It's piped into our infiltration system, and then that vastly reduces the amount of runoff that goes to the perimeter of the project. Where we have the slope transitions around the perimeter, as Sean just alluded to, Ms. O'Neill, again, through the chair for clarification, if we show an increase of runoff going to that property line, we're required to deal with it, and we put in stormwater swales, conveyance swales that redirect that water away from that property line. And that's what we've done in several areas around the property. So we're required to reduce that runoff that flows off site. And that's what these vast infiltration systems will do at the end of the day.
Was that after the first flood or the second or third that would get fixed?
So obviously that's a subjective statement on your part, but the systems are designed to work in a multitude of different storm events, as Mr. Reardon has really laid out here tonight eloquently from the town's peer reviewer perspective, and that we are required to analyze it for multiple storms, and they function the same across that platform.
I understand. I'm talking to a bunch of experts who know better than I do about this, but I'm the one who lives here and have to live with the consequences of this. And this is going to be another subjective statement. You're trying to blow up our neighborhood, and excuse me if we have a few concerns about how badly it's going to get blown up. Mm-hmm. And I'm sorry, it's not, it's hard for me to just go on blind faith, no matter how much expertise I'm listening to tonight. It's very difficult to just say this when we're not getting all the answers. We're just not. So we can agree to disagree, and I can be subjective, but it's my house, my property value and so forth that's getting destroyed in this project. Thank you.
Bev?
Sean Fahey?
Good evening, Mr. Chair, and good evening to the board. I live on Old Farm Road, Sean Fahey. I've introduced myself in prior meetings, and Mr. Shulman indicated that there were only a handful of people that might have experience that are participating in this meeting tonight. I consider myself a person that has adequate experience to speak. With my experience, I've spent 36 years in the construction industry. And as I've said in previous meetings, I've built an awful lot of complicated projects throughout New England and outside New England. The fact that the applicant is refusing to provide any information at all is indicative of what I have said previously. This is not a design that has a high level of success of achieving. I'm not sure if it has any level of success of achieving the design intent. I consider it a radical approach to site development. And I mean radical. I have an awful lot of respect for the civil engineer, but the fact of the matter is we're in a second civil engineer because the first civil engineer couldn't accomplish what the applicant wanted. To raise this site and import the volume of fill that's coming onto this site in an effort to try, and I do say try, to successfully manage stormwater is about as great a reach as you possibly could ask a civil engineer to go in drainage design. I have zero confidence that this design is going to work, and I am absolutely opposed to kicking the can down the road and having the project move to the Conservation Commission and, subject to their review, find at that point that it does or it doesn't work. I think the applicant should be forced to provide all the information requested to prove that this design works and not be allowed to move this project forward without doing so. We have a site contractor who's participating in the meeting tonight. His name is Andy Leonard. He's the owner of WW Contracting. We have asked Andy to take a very close look at this project and explain the complications that it would present for a site contractor. And if the chair would allow, I think Ned Corcoran would like Andy Leonard to speak to the complexity of this project from his perspective.
Why don't we continue to hear from members of the public, and then we can come back to that. I'd like everyone to have a chance. For every resident of the town who wants to speak, I'd like to get them on the record tonight. And I can come back to that gentleman.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Bev?
Right now, no, we don't have any more.
Okay, then fine. And I'm happy to hear from the gentleman if he's here. I have to say that even as a layman, I have a pretty good idea of what the complexity is. I'm not unmindful of the number of trucks and the amount of fill. And I mean, I think all the board members are very much aware of that, but I'm happy to hear from this gentleman to further explain the complexity. So if you want to bring him in, Bev, that would be fine.
Mm-hmm. Can you raise his hand, please, just to pull him up front? There we go. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I have two of the slides that I had prepared were based on materials that I submitted in early February with materials that Mr. Leonard had prepared. So if I can share screen, I can bring those slides up and he can speak to them.
Sure.
Am I on now?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Andy Leonard, WW Contracting Corp. So we were asked to look at the site. So we took this site off just as we were, if we were bidding it, and came up with a budget. And then I then proceeded to look at the logistics and the challenges of the site. What you're looking at now is really what we call a cut fill display, where red is the cut area and blue is the fill area. And the deeper the blue, the deeper the fill. And if you could see it magnified a little bit, each square there would have a number in it that would equal the fill, the average fill in that area. So there is a lot of fill obviously coming into the site, and it's been discussed, the logistical problems of taking it in. You know, obviously, if we were doing this project, which I just want to go on record, I don't want to do this project. So we would place a police detail at the entrance because getting the trucks in and out of the site is such a challenge, and we would want to get them in a cost-effective way. So that we would do that. But the real issues I saw as a site contractor were, other than the fill, is, and we do a lot of these infiltrator systems. We've done a lot of work with Allen and Majors over the years, and do have a lot of respect for their engineering. My concern with the volume of fill coming on this site, combined with the volume of the infiltrators, is that if you're not careful, that you're going to create displacement and you have to truck material off the site. So we would want to install the infiltrators early on, which creates future, how to protect the infiltrators, which we would obviously look to Allen and Majors to help us solve that. And then once the infiltrators are in, then you have issues of construction loads that have to drive over the infiltrators. So we kind of looked at bindering the site early on to protect those. And then one of the things, Sean, that I noticed that as a site contractor, sometimes we're happy about in a situation like this is the proximity of the sewer and the water to the infiltrator systems. And they go under the systems, which would create unnatural flow of the water leaching through. And so we would presume that some clay dams would be installed to protect that. But that's, you know, it's a very complicated job that will create a lot of thought to get the trucks off the road, because as the gentleman previously had explained, I think the gentleman, the contractor, those trucks will end up queued up the street. We looked at paving phase one early on to get those trucks off as quick as possible. So there's a lot going on here that would extend the schedule and will obviously add to cost, and that's really the developer's problem there. So
Andy, can you speak to this sheet? This is a abstract of the estimate that you prepared, basically with respect to exporters materials and importer materials. There's a lot of other line items that were included in your estimate that are excluded from this abstract, but if you can speak to what your assumptions were here.
Yeah, so what the gentleman in our office did, he stripped the loam, I believe a foot or two over the site, but that's just a mathematical, and that created almost 14,000 yards. And then we've captured all the import, and that includes the structural fill for the site, the 3/4 stone bedding for the utilities, the sand bedding for the utilities, the gravel for the parking lots, which gives you a total, the total import and export, because the loam is going to have to leave the site, and that'll have to leave the site early on to kind of maximize the trucks. You know, we would, as we imported structural fill, we would put the loam on to minimize the truck traffic. And then we did do an estimate. And so I don't know how many months ago that was, Ned, but I would say that's probably gone up by a factor of 15% in the last week with all the challenges we're all experiencing. But we had a total import and export of practically 70,000 yards, which we then turn that into truck trips, trailer dump loads in, and those trucks have to leave also. So we had a total truck traffic of 6,658 trucks heading up and down those roads. That do it, Ned?
Yeah, and in your estimate for that work, obviously is significant, about 5.7 million.
Yeah, and unfortunately, you know, we looked at a job this morning that we had bid probably 2 months ago, and it probably went up by a factor of 10%.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Leonard.
Thank you.
Anything else that anyone wants to present this evening?
Mr. Chair, if I may, could we just ask a couple of questions of Mr. Leonard before he goes away?
Sure.
Okay.
And directed through you, Mr. Chair. And just,
yes, I understand.
I'd like to thank Mr. Leonard for his presentation. I thought that was a lot of very helpful information. I guess the question I would have for him, because he made a lot of very specific and concrete suggestions about the project management and the construction management. And I heard a lot of good thoughts about that, police details and things like that to manage logistics. I guess the question I would have for Mr. Leonard, and I'm aware of his company, it's a very good contracting company. I know Alan and Major are aware of his company and have worked with him in the past. Does he believe that with a good, high quality contractor, a challenging site like this could be managed, such as by a firm like his own? Is that something you think could be done?
But there's a saying that money solves all problems. So anything can be done if it can be solved if enough money is put at it. If that answers your question, and I would reiterate that we don't want to do the job.
Noted. Thank you.
Anything else? Anything else for this evening?
I have some other information that's relevant to this. It deals with sort of the volumes and number of trucks, the timing, et cetera. You know, 3,300 dump loads. My understanding under the draft of the construction management plan that was submitted is that they anticipated 30 loads a day. That's 110 days of constant pounding on this stretch of Canton Avenue with the traffic that we know exists on Canton Avenue to add 51,000 cubic yards of fill to create this, what I call an earthen plinth, to build a project that doesn't fit on the property. They're importing and adding impact and cost and other components to build a project that just doesn't fit on this property, and raises all of these issues and concerns about stormwater, groundwater, and the like. So I got some additional slides. I can present them tonight. I can present them next week as the board, at the board's pleasure. I know it's 10 after 9. We've been at it for a couple of hours now. But
I think I'd like to just defer that until next week, if that's okay. And everyone can have their final opportunity to present whatever information they would like to present. Mr. Reardon, I would ask you to be present next week, if that's okay, for the next hearing, in case some questions come up that you could be of some assistance to us with. And
I know
otherwise,
I know that Mr. Horsley and Mr. Mobile and Mr.
that's my understanding, that they're gonna come back and present that they were just doing it on the fly tonight, and they were gonna present some additional information.
That's correct.
My hope is to gather up all the information that's been filed with the board over the last few weeks that relate to some of these issues, and sit down with a cup of tea on Sunday and just spend my day reading about water. But I hope to be completely up to speed and have read everything that's been presented to us, so that we can have a fruitful closing hearing next Tuesday night. I think the time has come. I think we've got the information that we're close to all the information that we're going to get. Now it's just a question of closing it out, maybe letting people have a chance to make sort of a final argument in support of their various positions, and then to move on to the process of deliberation. So that's my plan. So whatever you have in the pipeline, the sooner you get it to us, the better. It's not particularly helpful to get it on the day of the hearing or the evening before the hearing, because we all work and we have things to do, and you can't immediately jump on this stuff. So if you have it for a weekend, the chances of reading it and actually assimilating it, I think, are enhanced. And so anything you have that you want us to consider in connection with the hearing next week, get it to us as soon as possible. And it'll be open to whoever wants to present information. All information here is good and helpful to us, and so we'll keep the meeting open next week until we have everything that everyone wants to present.
Mr. Chair, yeah, thank you, Bev. Tim Zerwinski, Director of Planning and Community Development. I just wanted to jump in. We have town meeting next Tuesday, so I don't think
Wonderful.
next week is going to work.
Okay.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
I was told by I was talking with the moderator the other night, and he said if we had to go a second night, it would be Monday and Wednesday and not Monday and Tuesday. So maybe Mr. Zawinski has different information though. Bev, do you know?
Pardon me?
I'm not sure I know what you were saying, Ted.
Are you meaning?
I was told that town meeting would not go on Tuesday next week, that if it starts Monday, so that if we need 2 nights, the second night would be Wednesday and not Tuesday. I was told that by the moderator, but it sounds like Tim has different information.
I may not have different. My understanding typically, and this happened at the last town meeting that we had, that it's Monday, Tuesday, and then Wednesday is the day we skip, and then Thursday is the third day. You may be absolutely right, but I thought we were doing Monday and Tuesday. I can try to.
It is typical. Yeah, it is typical to have it Monday, Tuesday, and then Thursday. Actually, they usually don't sit on Wednesday, but.
Well, I think we have to deal with this issue now. I think while we're on the public record, whatever day we're going to pick to do it, I think we ought to do that tonight. Mr. Schumer, if we had to put it off until the following week, would you be willing to further extend for one more week for the close of the public hearing?
I think that's reasonable, Mr. Chair. If there's town meeting, I do see that the chair of your select board has raised her hand, so she may have some more definitive information about the scheduling of that.
Bev, can you have that person come on?
Yeah, I'm opening. So I just got an email. Town meeting is scheduled for 3/14 and 3/16.
Well then, thank you, Mr. Daber, for that correction. I guess we're all set to go. Sorry for the confusion, everybody.
So Tuesday night is open then, is that right? 3:15, the Ides of March.
Monday and yes, 3:15 is open.
So let's go forward on March 15th as we had originally planned.
I apologize, Mr. Chair. I thought I was on top of things and I'm on the bottom, I guess.
That's
Don't be
okay.
so
Tim.
adamant
No,
about
you're,
that. Oh,
Okay, and again, I ask everyone, to the extent you're gonna present any further written material to us, please do as soon as you can, because it will be helpful if we can sort of read it over the weekend in anticipation of hearing. And as I said, we'll go as long as it takes to get in every bit of opinion, information that we can before we close the public hearing. This has been helpful tonight. It's a complicated subject. It's many people are working hard to try and advocate their positions, and we'll go forward. Thank you all for participating, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you.
Good night.